Before I start my 8-minute sprint, the history of the American Empire, I'd like to comment briefly on something you said. You talked about the 4.5 million people who died as a result of America's war on terror post 9/11. When Robert McNamara, former Secretary of Defense, came into my class several years ago, he said he accepted that 3.8 million Vietnamese died during the U.S. invasion of Vietnam. And that's a stunning figure, much higher than you'll read in most of the books. I think it's accurate. Most of my students, when I ask them, say they've visited the Vietnam Memorial Monument in Washington, D.C. Almost all of them have, at least pre-COVID. And if you go there, you've got the names of 58,280 Americans who died in Vietnam. The two walls there that the names are on are 492 feet long. I calculate that, and the message of that memorial is that the tragedy of Vietnam was that 58,280 Americans died. But if that memorial actually had the names also of the 3.8 million Vietnamese, the million Laotians and Cambodians, all the Brits and Aussies and Thais and South Koreans and others who died, it would actually be more than 8 miles long. And that would be a fitting memorial to the Vietnam War. The memorial we're going to need to the last 20 years of wars is going to be even longer than that. And that's another tragic commentary. But now I'll start on the clock. As a historian, I frame 9/11 a little differently than most people do. For me, 9/11 begins not in 2001, but back in 1978, with the coming to power in Afghanistan of the pro-Soviet secular Taraki Amin government, which was initially, even the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and Washington Post said had tremendous popular support. Well, it did have some popular support, but it also had a lot of opposition because their program was basically threefold. One was modernization, industrialization. Secondly, it was land reform. And thirdly, was education. Now, this is a country, Taraki said at the time that the future looks very bright for the Afghan people. The New York Times reporter William Borders took issue with that. He said the future does not look bright. This is a country that has an average life expectancy of 40 years, an average GDP of $70, the equivalent of 20 cents a day, 10% literacy rates. They say this really hasn't changed at all from 2,000 years earlier when Alexander the Great went through there and saw the same mud huts. But so the tasks that confronted them were enormous. But the group that was triggered by the reforms that the secular government was proposing in Afghanistan was the Mujahideen, Islamic extremists. And what they hated more than anything else was the fact that the new government was educating women. The people who the U.S. supported, this was Brzezinski's project, were the ones who were going into the schools and shooting the teachers and actually going in there and skinning them alive. But Brzezinski saw an opportunity here. Fanatically anti-Soviet, anti-communist national security advisors, the big near Brzezinski, started working with the CIA without the support of Carter in order to inflame and support these Islamic extremists. Finally, on July 3rd, 1979, Carter signs the memorandum authorizing U.S. military support. And Brzezinski wrote, it was July 3rd, 1979, that President Carter signed the first directive for secret aid to the opponents of the pro-Soviet regime in Kabul. And that very day, I wrote a note to the president, which I explained to him that, in my opinion, this aid was going to induce a Soviet military intervention. So that Brzezinski knew that, and he understood that this Islamic rebellion uprising inside Afghanistan was going to terrify the Soviet leaders because they were afraid that there'd be a similar uprising of the 40 million Muslims inside the Soviet Union. So the new government there asked the Soviets for military help. The Soviets hesitated to do so because Brezhnev and the others knew that the Soviet intervention would mean the end of détente, mean the end of SALT II, would mean effectively the end of the Olympics. So they didn't do so until Christmas Day, 1979, when they finally do intervene. Brezhnev mistakenly said it was going to take 3 or 4 weeks, we'll be out of there. They were in there for another 10 years. But when that happened, the sanctimonious Brzezinski and even Carter were making these public statements about how appalled they were. Brzezinski wasn't appalled. He was ecstatic. He said, now we've finally given the Soviet Union its own Vietnam. And Carter absurdly called the invasion, quote, the greatest threat to peace since the Second World War. He announced the Carter Doctrine, which initiated a whole new state level of American involvement in the Middle East at that point. But the war really escalates under Reagan. And it was under Reagan that the CIA spent $3 billion for the biggest covert operation up to that point to support these mujahideen. They were supported in camps in Pakistan with money from Saudi Arabia, money and training from the United States, and we were training them in not only in assassination and terrorism, but Islamic extremism there. And so these were the people who later formed the Taliban. That's where Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri were being trained. A lot of the people who blow back on us much later. But the people we were supporting were the extremists. We were supporting, for example, we gave money to Zia, president of Pakistan, who was channeling it to Gulbuddin Haqbatiyar, a man of legendary cruelty, who, according to the director of terrorism studies at West Point, quote, was known to patrol the bazaars of Kabul with vials of acid, which he would throw in the face of any woman who dared to walk outdoors without a full burqa covering her face. These are the people we were supporting. When Gorbachev took office in 1985 in the Soviet Union, he tried to withdraw Soviet troops, but the U.S. did everything it could to tie the Soviets down as long as we could. The Soviets withdraw in 1989, the government falls in 1992. The Soviets asked the U.S. to work with them to curb extremism in Afghanistan. The U.S. could not be bothered. A civil war ensues there, and led by, there were couple factions. One was the refugees who studied in madrasas in Pakistan, the Saudi-funded Wahhabi training madrasas, the religious schools in Pakistan. The religious students were known as the Talibs, and they later go on to form the Taliban with the help from Pakistani intelligence. Many had received their military training in the U.S. Supported camps. Many of those were educated in these schools with books that were written in training manuals from the University of Nebraska at Omaha Center for Afghanistan Studies, and with violently horrible books that were being used, that the Taliban used themselves when they took power in 1996, simply taking out the human pictures, which they considered blasphemous. According to the RAND expert Cheryl Bernard, whose husband Zalmay Khalilzad had been the main U.S. liaison to Afghanistan, who was recently in charge of negotiations with the Taliban, she wrote, "We made a deliberate choice. At first, everyone thought there's no way to beat the Soviets, so what we have to do is throw the worst crazies against them that we can find." And there was a lot of collateral damage. We knew exactly who these people were and what their organizations were like, and we didn't care. Then we allowed them to get rid of, just kill all the moderate leaders. The reason we don't have any moderate leaders in Afghanistan today is because we let the nuts kill them all. They killed the leftists, the moderates, the middle of the roaders. They were just eliminated during the 1980s and afterwards. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the neocons were again ecstatic. In 1990, neocon strategist Charles Krauthammer announces that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the U.S. is the world's unipolar power. He says that this could last 30 or 40 years. They come up in 1993 with a defense planning guidance, which talks about the U.S. is so powerful, we cannot allow anybody to emerge anywhere in any region who can threaten the United States, even in that specific region. They were forced to walk it back, but the people behind this, the Wolfowitzes and the others, then go on to form the Project for a New American Century. These folks are, again, the neocon strategists for empire, who are the ones who go into the George W. Bush administration and push the crazy wars that we've been talking about. In the year 2000, they came up with a report that many people are familiar with called Rebuilding America's Defenses. And they said the kind of defense spending we like is likely to be a long one to rebuild, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. Well, they got that on 9/11. And even that, the history there is very, very murky. My friends of mine who were in the FBI in Minneapolis were reporting back to Washington about Muslims who were learning how to fly and had no interest in learning how to land their planes. Those reports were coming back here. Bush was getting briefed almost daily in the president's daily briefings with reports like headlines, Osama bin Laden planning to attack in the United States. We knew what was happening. The NSC counterterrorism chief, Richard Clark, testified that CIA Director George Tenet was running around Washington with his hair on fire, trying to get the attention of Bush, Rice, and Rumsfeld. They couldn't be bothered. They didn't care. And then the attack hits. Then they're ready to move quickly with the Patriot Act. They begin talking about the invasion of Iraq, as Phyllis was saying, on 9/11 and 9/12. But first, the U.S. has got to invade Afghanistan, which takes place within days of the attack on 9/11. But we gave Afghanistan an ultimatum. We said, turn over bin Laden and the al-Qaeda leaders, or else we're going to invade. Well, according to Milton Bearden, who was the U.S. station chief in Pakistan and ran the war from there between 1986 and 1989, he said that the Taliban were desperate to give up bin Laden. He said they wanted some face-saving help from the United States. They offered to give him up to the Organization of Islamic Conferences, but the United States did not comply. We wanted to invade, and we did invade, and that was in early October. But as early as October 15, 2001, William Crystal's Weekly Standard had a cover story titled "Making the Case for American Empire." And the neocons start coming out of the woodwork. In 2002, Charles Krauthammer revisited his idea, this is the unipolar moment, and he said, I was wrong. I underestimated. He said that U.S. domination is so powerful, nothing has ever existed like this disparity of power, nothing. He said he was wrong, that it was not the unipolar moment, it was the unipolar era. It was not going to last 30 or 40 years. It was going to last indefinitely into the future. Then with the invasion of Iraq, and even before that, on January 5th, 2003, the New York Times headlined its Sunday magazine section, American Empire, Get Used to It. And they all came out of the woodwork then. For example, a British senior official told Newsweek, everyone wants to go to Baghdad. Real men want to go to Tehran. Undersecretary of State John Bolton, who the North Koreans have called human scum and a bloodsucker, Bolton voted for going after Syria and North Korea. They all came up with their lists. Retired General Wesley Clark visited the Pentagon in November 2001 and was told by his senior military officer of a 5-year campaign that was going to begin with Afghanistan, then Iraq, then Syria, then Lebanon, then Libya, then Iran, then Somalia, then Sudan. They had this whole thing mapped out. Unfortunately for them, things went down very quickly in Afghanistan and Iraq. By September 2004, Amr Musa, the head of the Arab League, announced, quote, "The gates of hell are open in Iraq." It became a jihadi Super Bowl. They all came in from all around the world. And by 2006, even Krauthammer got it. He penned an obituary for the unipolar era. He announced that unipolarity had peaked in 2005 and was now past the apogee, he said. And from then, we now have had another 15 years of U.S. flailing about, fighting these wars at a time when the U.S. empire has been in its death throes. But that has not stopped us. And as Larry was saying earlier, talking about the threats from climate change, talking about the nuclear threat, the dangers that we face, which I could go on for a long time, but I don't have time to do it. I just want to say that we're still bombing 7 Muslim countries. We still have 800 bases around the world. I mean, U.S. is trying to maintain this unipolarity in a multipolar world, and it's not going to work. And it's not only wrong-headed, it's extraordinarily dangerous, which is why the bullet atomic scientist has the hands of the doomsday clock at 100 seconds before midnight, the closest it's ever been. And so we're facing a very perilous situation that I look forward to discussing with everybody in this question and answer period.
Thank you so much, Peter.